Once upon a time, there was an American businessman who turned himself into the Silk King of Thailand. He hosted legendary dinner parties at his house, and he was also known for his efforts to work with the local weavers. This man also had a background in the military, more specifically in one of the predecessor organizations of the CIA. Maybe he was an agent, and one day he disappeared in the Malaysian jungle. Sounds like a movie? It's not. It's a true story. It's the one about Jim Thompson, and this is the story I'm going to share today. If you have traveled to Bangkok, I'm sure you have heard about the name Jim Thompson, or you have passed by one of the stores, maybe the one at the airport. This is the one most tourists notice. I first heard about Jim Thompson at a dinner party. A friend mentioned the brand and said, oh, you should check it out. They have really nice stuff. And by the way, we think he was a spy and he disappeared in the Malaysian jungle. So I was intrigued. Fashion and an interesting story. So I went the next day and I looked at the products, the interesting silk prints, also the cashmere products that they had. I actually discovered this top on that very first trip to one of the stores. By the way, this is a non-sponsored post. I'm just sharing my personal opinion and my research here. And Jim Thompson today is a global brand, and to a certain degree they stayed true to their core business, to the roots, because they are still in the wholesale business for silk. They supply hotels, for example, the Mandarin Oriental in Bangkok, for example, which I'm going to discuss a bit later. But they also offer other products which were already introduced under Jim Thompson, the founder. For example, printed silk scarves, but also scarves made from other materials like cashmere, for example. They also moved into apparel, menswear and women's wear. They also had an amazing children's line. Unfortunately, they stopped. So if anybody from the company is watching, please bring back the baby and children's clothing. It's really, really cute. And they also own restaurants. There's the Jim Thompson house, and they also have an art space. So you can see it developed into, we could say, the world of Jim Thompson. I would like to look more into this story. First of all, how did an American businessman in the late 40s, early 50s found such a business in Thailand? What's his backstory? I'm always intrigued by hearing these success stories, how people build their businesses, and also at a time where Bangkok was quite interesting, I think. And then I would like to do a bit of detective work. I love Agatha Christie, so maybe we can be Miss Marple or Hercule Poirot for one day, maybe a more fashionable version of them, and look into this disappearance. What actually happened there? How could this man disappear? And what were all these mysterious theories around his disappearance? Just quickly before I start, I based my research on the information available online and also one book by William Warren, which I will also cite on thepinklookbook.com in my article. And there have been many books about Jim Thompson. When you enter it in Google, you will see how many books come up. But I found a lot of them a bit too speculative, a bit too much leaning on this conspiracy theory. And while William Warren's book also has certain tendencies, I think it's one of the books that I found most reliable when it comes to the information, especially also the disappearance of Jim Thompson. I structured this video into two parts. One is the business side. How did he come to Thailand? How did he build up the business? This also offers the background for the second part, which is about his disappearance. And this is quite a long video, but I wanted to give you this deep dive into the story because I find this so interesting. On the one hand, we have this fashion story, how he built up the business, and then we have the detective work that we can do. Let's start at the beginnings. Jim Thompson today is known for his interesting, maybe even eccentric or flamboyant lifestyle in Bangkok. But when we look at the beginnings, it all started out very, very differently. He was born in 1907 in Delaware. When we think of fashion or all the people he would meet, the celebrities that would wear the clothes, also that the clothes then were featured in Vogue, you would not think that everything started out in Delaware, but that's where it started. He was born into a quite well-off family, which was a big part of the Delaware society. This family had a very interesting social life. They were mingling with the who is who, we could say, and they were also traveling at a time where travel was not accessible to everyone. It was only accessible to a very small percentage of the population. And one person who I found very interesting is his grandfather, James Harrison Wilson. Jim Thompson is actually called James, so he's named after his grandfather. And this grandfather was the military representative of the United States at the coronation of King Edward VII in 1902. And this is where he met the then Crown Prince of Thailand, who would later become King Rama VI, who is the great-great-grandfather of the current King of Thailand and also the son of the famous King Chulalongkorn, Rama V. He was also friends with Wilson's daughter, so Jim Thompson's mother, Eleanor, and she was actually invited by him to join festivities in Oxford, where he studied. And during his first official tour during the US, he actually stayed with the Wilsons in Delaware. We can already see this family was relatively or very international for the time. And also there was this connection to Thailand, but it would be a step too far if we said this was the reason, the grandfather was the reason why Jim Thompson ended up in Thailand. There were actually other reasons why he made that move, and I'm going to talk about this in a bit. So the little Jim Thompson went to school in Delaware, then he went to boarding school, and then he graduated from Princeton, the family university, in 1928, so we can already see the status of the family. Later on, he enrolled in architecture, but he never graduated from it. And then he moved to New York to work in the field of architecture in the 1930s. But he actually did not pass the architectural board exam. But nevertheless, he did some work along the East Coast and he was actually quite successful. And he also had quite a colorful party life in New York City. The more I read about Jim Thompson, the more I had the feeling that this was probably not his easiest time in his life. Very often articles say, also the book by William Warren says that he actually never really talked about his time in New York, maybe because he saw it as a failure, because he didn't pass that exam or he could not become a full-on architect. What he did talk about was his passion for the ballet. This already started very early because as a young boy he already discovered a book about the costumes designed by Leon Bakst for the Diaghilev ballet in Paris. And this was a gift that his mother gave him and he always cherished this. And maybe you also remember Leon Bakst. I mentioned him in my other video about Coco Chanel, about the exhibition. So maybe you want to check that out too. So he was always very much inspired by ballet. And for some time he actually was the director of the Monte Carlo Ballet, which would later become the New York City Ballet. And also remember that he was very much interested in costumes because this is something that we are going to come across later. So he had this busy life in New York as a designer and he also attended all of these parties, and suddenly at the end of the 30s his attitude changes completely. He changes his political views, he criticizes people for their frivolous lifestyle, so completely different to what he did before, and he joins the military, maybe because of this change of mindset. And after some time in the military he changes to the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, an intelligence agency which would later be absorbed into the CIA. So this is something that a lot of people focus on when they read his CV basically. And in 1942 he also got married. He met Pat Thraves. I hope I said the name correctly. But 6 months after they got married, he had to go to North Africa. This was in the middle of the Second World War. He was then sent from North Africa via Italy to France. This was basically following the war strategy. We don't really know what he was doing because he never spoke about it. So it was a highly classified thing that he was doing, we can assume, and probably also very high risk. And when the war ended in Europe, he was then sent to Thailand, so completely other part of the world. He was trained for the invasion of Thailand, and part of his training was also that he was dropped on a deserted island and he had to fend for himself. And this is something very important that we need for the second part, for the detective story, because he always was very proud of this fact that he had that training, that he could survive in the jungle. And then it's also a bit ironic that this person with this intensive training actually disappeared in the Malaysian jungle. Or maybe it's not ironic, maybe because something else happened. So the initial plan was that Jim Thompson and a few others would parachute into Thailand. They took off by plane in Cambodia, and then after some time, suddenly they got informed that the war was over, Japan had surrendered. So when he arrived in Bangkok, he immediately fell in love with the city. He also helped to set up a temporary American consulate, and he met Connie Mangskow. I hope I said the name correctly. We need to remember that name very well because she should become one of his closest friends. She was a half British, half Thai interpreter during the war, and then she became an antique dealer, and she was actually with Jim Thompson on the trip in Malaysia when he disappeared. And Jim Thompson was just fascinated with the city, and he also saw a big opportunity. He knew that peace and also long distance travel by plane, which would become more and more accessible to many people, would make Thailand very attractive for tourists. So he was already kind of looking into the hotel industry, because at the time, you would not believe it, but there were not many hotels in Bangkok. Today, the density of hotels in Bangkok is just crazy, but back then you only had a few, and they did not really come up to the standards of foreigners traveling to the country. There was only one, and this was the Oriental Hotel. And today, this is the famous Mandarin Oriental Hotel, which is one of the best hotels in the world. But when Jim Thompson discovered it, it was, let's say, a hidden gem, or it was very basic, because the kitchen was not really elaborated, the rooms were really basic. There are quite some funny stories in the book about how people had to wash themselves or shower, so maybe you want to read up on this. But Jim Thompson saw the potential, because it was a meetup. It was a hub for all the foreigners who are called Farangs in Bangkok or in Thailand. And there were also celebrity guests. Charlie Chaplin stayed there, European royalty stayed there. So he knew he was onto something. Singapore had the Raffles Hotel, Hong Kong the Peninsula, and Bangkok would soon have the Oriental. So he somehow met Jermaine Krull, who was a German-Dutch photographer and also war correspondent, and they had the plan of purchasing the hotel and renovating it. But before this project with Jermaine Krull and 4 other partners really took off, he had to go back to America, because in 1946 he got the orders to go back. And in the beginning, he was very positive about this trip. Maybe he was a bit naive. Remember, he still had a wife in America who he married in 1942. But his plan was to go back, and maybe he could convince her to join him, because Bangkok was such a great city, and maybe she would pack her things and just move for him to Bangkok. But then he was disappointed, because right after he arrived in America, his wife asked for a divorce, which was very, very tough for him to accept. And he tried to distract himself by looking for investors for the Oriental Hotel. Maybe this was one of the factors why he then finally decided to really make this move and come back to Thailand and set up the hotel. And there are many stories about Jim Thompson, also about his love life. There are a lot of rumors, and there's a lot of speculation, because he actually never remarried. And then people came up with these stories. Maybe he was just an eligible bachelor, or he was a homosexual, because he never remarried. He worked in design. I don't know what these assumptions were, but his friend Connie Mangskar actually said that he had quite a few relationships with women in Bangkok, and one lasted 10 years. It's just obviously that he didn't really talk about it. And some people even say that him and Connie Mangskar were a couple, but she said they were never romantically involved. So let's also get his love life out of the way and move on. So he comes back in 1947, he leaves America behind for the time being, and he falls in love with Bangkok again. And it was quite easy to fall in love with Bangkok at the time, I guess, because Bangkok, in contrast to many other cities in Southeast Asia, was not that affected by the war. Yes, it was not the life that people had in Europe or in the United States, because there was no air conditioning, so it was really hot. There were mosquitoes, there were constantly some diseases. For example, they had to boil the water because of cholera. There were floodings, so people had to wade through the water, but still there was kind of a charm. Bangkok, you may know, is very often called Venice of the East. Today you don't really know why anymore, but the city was connected via the klongs, the canals. A lot of them have been turned into roads, unfortunately, but this is how the city worked. And also, as I mentioned before, the Farang community, the community of foreigners, was very small, very close-knit, and he was very well connected within that community, but also with the locals. And he also had a lot of friends who were Laotian, for example, Vietnamese or Burmese. And the Laotian friends in the long run would be very instrumental for him in setting up the silk business. But before he set up the silk business, we have to close the story about the Oriental Hotel. So he comes back. He wants to work on the hotel, and then there are different stories depending who told the story, because there must have been some kind of disagreement or argument between Jim Thompson and Germaine Crowell. They parted ways, and Germaine Crowell then set up the Oriental with the other partners on her own. This is very interesting because when you visit the Mandarin Oriental today, you see Jim Thompson everywhere. So most of the textiles are referenced to Jim Thompson. Then in the lobby, they have a big fan with a print by Jim Thompson. There's also a Jim Thompson outlet in the hotel. And most people in Bangkok will tell you he was the founder or the co-owner or the owner of the hotel. So for a very long time, I thought he owned the hotel for a very long time, but basically it was not that long because he and Germaine Crowell parted ways. He then stayed on for another year until 1949 in the hotel, but he always tried to avoid Germaine Crowell. And only 20 years later did he design or decorate some of the suites of the hotel. So I find this so interesting that everything in that hotel is told about Jim Thompson, of course, probably because of his publicity. But I had never heard about Germaine Crowell before I read the book by William Warren. I don't know the reason. Maybe I have to look into that more. If you want me to do another video about the history of the Mandarin Oriental Hotel, let me know in the comments below. This is actually something that I have been planning for quite some time, and if you are interested in that, I have even more reason to do that video. So another disappointment for Jim Thompson. So he was kind of looking for something else to do. He didn't want a political career. I said before he helped setting up the temporary consulate. Probably because of his connections, this would have been also a possibility, but he wasn't really interested in that. And then together with his Laotian friends, he did a lot of trips to Isan, which is the northeastern region of Thailand. It is a very poor region of Thailand, but it is also very famous for the silk production. I mentioned this in my other video about Queen Sirikit of Thailand and her collaboration with Pierre Balmain. During these trips, he got to know the tradition of silk weaving, and he also got to know the weavers. And many people say Jim Thompson invented Thai silk because it got so popular under him. But Thailand did not need a foreigner for silk. Well, in a certain way, they were influenced by foreigners because silk came from China. Many Southeast Asian countries discovered silk that way. And then they had a very thriving silk production within the country. But the problem was that by the time Jim Thompson was in Bangkok, silk had become kind of uninteresting for the locals. Silk was very expensive to make because it was handmade. It was only used for clothing for special events, for example, for weddings, for example, or birthdays or big events at the temples. But local Thais did not really want to wear silk anymore. They wanted to wear more the Western style clothing, which was also a bit easier to wear. And then there was also the competition from textiles made in Europe and Japan. So there was a lot of competition. It was a very challenging environment, and this meant that weaving was then limited to a few families within Bangkok, and they all lived in the Bang Krua area. This area is today around Siam Station, where you have a lot of malls. Also, the National Stadium is near there, and this is also where Jim Thompson's house, which is now a museum, is located. This is the part that I personally find most interesting because it reminded me also of how I looked for partners or still look for partners, how I try to establish relationships with weavers and craftspeople. So what he did was that he visited these families in Bang Krua. Also, another detail is these families are mostly Muslim, which is interesting because most of Thailand is Buddhist. But the silk trade was very much influenced by the Muslim minority, and this is actually also something which holds true in other countries, which is quite interesting. So he went to the weavers in Bang Krua, he sat with them, he looked how they are working, and this man had no experience whatsoever in fashion or silk. He did not know anything about the production. He learned from the weavers, despite not speaking the local language. He did not speak Thai. So I don't know how he did that. Probably his friends then supported him, but this is how he learned. And he was a collector. He collected antiques. I'm going to cover that later. But now the importance is that he collected silks. And at the time he collected sarongs, which were worn by men and women in Thailand. But the sarongs were at a certain length, and it was very difficult to get a length which was not this sarong length. And furthermore, these fabrics were dyed with natural colors, which can be positive, but if you wash them too often, the colors fade. For local Thais, it was not so much of an issue because these garments, as I said before, were only worn at special occasions, very rarely, and then they were kept in trunks. So they did not really fade because they were only washed a few times. But he already had this idea of exporting the silk or using the silk for something else. So in the long run, Jim Thompson also looked into substitutes for these natural dyes. And then he had to convince the weavers. And this was very difficult, and I can imagine how difficult it was because they were very skeptical. He knew nothing about the trade, he didn't speak their language, and then he told them, we will sell the silk from Thailand all over the world. They already had this competition within the country and from abroad. How was this going to work? But he found one weaver who produced 100 yards for him. This is about 90 meters, just so that he had prototypes. This weaver later on would also get shares in his company, and he would turn out really wealthy because of this collaboration. And then Jim Thompson left to America with suitcases full of silk. And then he was a bit naive, or maybe he was bold, we could say. I kind of admire him for it because he knew nothing about the fashion industry. He had no contacts whatsoever. But from his New York Times, he had one friend who used to be the editor of Vanity Fair. So he called him, tells him about the silk business, and this person gets him a meeting with Edna Woolman Chase. She was the editor-in-chief of Vogue, can you imagine, at the time. He shows up at her office and shows around the silks. She also then brought in other people from the office. They were all really amazed by the quality. And then she offered to leave the silks with her. She would show them around. The Vogue editor-in-chief showed his silks around. And actually the designer Valentina from New York ended up using parts of this silk for a dress, and then she was photographed in it, and actually Jim Thompson was credited in the newspaper or magazine that featured it. So when this came out, of course, this was proof for Jim Thompson. Today we would say proof of concept. He took this and went back to the weavers, and slowly they also trusted him with his crazy ideas and also believed in his vision. Back in Bangkok, he promoted the silk everywhere with friends. He even stood in the lobby of the Oriental hotel and was holding some silks, and then he just started talking to people and made them buy something. So he must have been an amazing salesman. And then in 1948, after a year of planning, he decided to found the Thai Silk Company. And again, there are a lot of stories around this company. Many people think he was the sole owner of the company, but that's actually not true. And this is something that he himself never said. In many interviews, he stressed that the company was majority owned by Thai locals, that he only held a minority share and got a salary. And there's also another myth around this, maybe because it's a bit romantic. A lot of people say he founded the company on a shoestring budget, which is also not true. And if you think about the trade, this is very difficult. Like, how would you finance so much silk with a shoestring budget? But it's a very romanticized story. I know even today newspapers and magazines love these stories. So maybe even he himself fueled it, I don't know, but actually they needed 25,000 US dollars, which at the time was a lot of money. It still is a lot of money, but even more back then. So he got in the partners, they founded this company, and in the long run, because the business was so successful, it grew over time. And according to William Warren in 1980, some shareholders cashed out and they made $1 million US. So you could see how successful the business was. And then just quickly, let's talk about a third myth that we need to clarify here. A lot of the newspapers at the time of his disappearance said he was a millionaire. Actually, he was far from that, because even though he had this share in the company and he also had a salary, the salary was good. He started with 3,000 US dollars in the beginning. Then he made 33,000 US dollars at the time of his disappearance, which was a lot of money, but he was not a millionaire. He was wealthy because he also inherited an estate, quite a big estate from a cousin, but this was nowhere near being a millionaire. So this is also something that was reported falsely during the time of his disappearance and also after. And what I find interesting about Jim Thompson is that he kept the silk industry in Thailand a cottage industry, which means that the weavers work from home. They decide how much they want to weave and then hence also how much money they want to make or can make per month. And a lot of people told him, just found a factory, employ the weavers, then you dictate the terms. It's also not that easy for them to basically run away and do their own thing. But Jim Thompson was not interested at all in this. And one thing that I read about him, which I found very interesting, is that he actually thought that competition is great because competition keeps people creative, innovative. So he was not really afraid that people were running away, or maybe he was, but then he was very confident and knew what he was doing. So there were stories where people left him and they wanted to set up their own thing or they wanted to go to the competition, but very often he saw them fail because he had this talent, this view of quality. He was also more than talented with colors. As I said before, he was not a big fan of the natural dyes, so he substituted them with chemical dyes from Switzerland, which allowed him to make really eclectic designs. So he was constantly trying to make something new, and he obviously thought the best way of doing this is by establishing trust with the weavers, not be too occupied with who could leave him or what would they do, because the products would speak for themselves. He did influence the processes or make them a bit more efficient. For example, he substituted the very slow hand looms by foot operated ones, but in the end he never wanted that big factory setting. And it is a bit ironic because in the 1980s, long after he disappeared, Jim Thompson, the company, set up a factory, but when we look at it today, they are quite successful in what they are doing. They still kept the quality, so maybe this is a factory that Jim Thompson himself would have approved of. And what we can all learn from Jim Thompson, if you own a business, is how he sold himself, how he sold the business, how he did the marketing, because he was such an amazing networker. He hosted so many people in his houses also later on. And in 1949, Charles Baskerville, quite a successful painter from New York, came to visit him, and he was really connected with the celebrities in America. And Jim Thompson took care of him. He went on day trips with him. He introduced him to the weavers. He even threw a birthday party for him. So when Baskerville left for the US, he packed a lot of silk with him, and he showed them to Diana Vreeland. So again, it's something that shows how strong the network was, and because of Diana Vreeland, the Thai silk produced by Jim Thompson then landed in Hollywood, on Broadway, and it was in movies and productions like The King and I, but also in Ben-Hur, for example. Hotels used the silk, for example, the Savoy Hotel in London, then also the Hilton in Hong Kong. But there were also private orders. For example, Barbara Hutton used the silk for her houses in Morocco and in Mexico. There was a steel manufacturer from the US who designed their executive suites, and they used silk interwoven with aluminum. And the biggest local fan was Queen Sirikit of Thailand, because she has been supporting the silk industry and also other textiles in the country. She also helped to basically bring them back and make them wearable again. For example, with her collaboration with Pierre Balmain for her clothing, she heavily promoted Thai silk, not only abroad during the tour through America and Europe, but also at home. So if you want to learn more about this, you can also head over to my other video. And in the 50s, you could really see the business, how successful it was. Jim Thompson was everywhere. On the one hand, there were all the magazines and newspapers writing about him. He was in the New York Times, he was in Harper's Bazaar, in Vogue, many others. But also other countries with cottage industries actually contacted him to help them to revive those industries, basically. And then the more successful he got, he also realized that probably his stay in Thailand would be semi-permanent, and he started looking for a house. And this is also something really interesting about him. The first house was near Klong, which is today gone. It was near Ramapho and Lumpini Park. And this was a very basic house. It's a Thai house that can be folded, you have to imagine. These houses are made from wood, and they can be removed very easily if people move, and then they can build up that house again. So he first lived in that house, but he loved to collect silk and antiques. And then soon this house became too small, and he found a plot in that area that I mentioned before, near Bang Krua, where all the weavers are, directly at the Klong. So basically on the other side of the Klong there are the weavers, And there he set up this very interesting home made of multiple Thai traditional houses. I think it's 6 traditional houses that form this home. And this collection of houses, when you go to the museum, you can still see it. It's traditional Thai houses again, wooden houses on stilts. This was protection from the floods on the one hand, but you could also keep livestock underneath. Also, Jim Thompson had a lot of pets. He had dogs, cats, bantam chicken. He also had a cockatoo that entertained his guests, so he loved animals. And he hosted dinners for 6 to 10 people every day. So maybe this is something that we can learn from him, network by hosting dinners every day. And in the 50s and 60s, the company constantly grew. He experimented with new products, and the advantage that he had was that the business side was handled by Charles Sheffield. So he could focus on the creative side. He didn't have to bother with the boring business stuff. What he did do was also he had opened a small shop in Suriwong Road before, but because the business was so successful and they needed a better showroom for tourists coming to the city and also locals, they moved to a bigger location also on Suriwong Road, and this is a store that you can still visit today. And if you go to Bangkok, I highly recommend that you visit it because it's very beautiful. They also have a small exhibition about weaving. They have all the products displayed, and it's again a traditional Thai wooden house where you can shop for Jim Thompson products. And this brings me to part 2 of this video, the mysterious disappearance, because this shop on Suriwong Road only opened shortly before he left to Malaysia. So these weeks leading up to the trip were really intense. I already said before, he was basically constantly working, then he was also entertaining, and in addition to that, he now opened a new store. Everything had to be moved, you needed the new decoration, you needed the launch, everything. So he was very, very busy, but also tired. I imagine that he looked forward to that trip. 2 days before he left for Malaysia, he had turned 61, and for a man of his age, he was in relatively good health. So the only thing that sometimes bothered him was gallstone attacks, but he had medication for this. He kept them in a small box, which he called the jungle box, and he brought this box of pills everywhere he went on trips, for example. He was a heavy smoker, and of course he was quite restless and stressed out, but apart from that, he was actually in very good health. Jim Thompson went to Malaysia with his friend Connie Mangskor, and they were actually invited by a couple from Singapore, Dr. T.J. Ling and his wife Helen, and they were also antique dealers, so that's why they knew Connie Mangskor. The cottage that they owned was in the Cameron Highlands in Malaysia, and whenever they were not in the Cameron Highlands, they rented out the property with the help of a local couple who were their rental agents basically. And how did you get to that remote resort? You had to fly to Penang or Kuala Lumpur, and then it's a 5-hour drive from Penang or a 7-hour drive from Kuala Lumpur. And this area, the Cameron Highlands, have quite a colorful past because it's very remote and very quiet. But during the colonial times, it was a popular destination for the rich elites, especially from Singapore, for example. But then there was the Japanese occupation. But after the liberation in 1945, there was a period called the Malayan Emergency. And this also happened in the area of the Cameron Highlands. When this whole situation was over, the insurgents were pushed towards the border with Thailand. But after that, there were still stories that there are some scary groups, some gangs in the area. So it never really lost that past. But by the time when Jim Thompson came in 1967, it was already again an established holiday destination, especially for the upper class from Malaysia or also Singapore. There were also many stories and rumors about the cottage of the Lings, especially after Jim Thompson disappeared, because some people said that gangs had used the cottage before the Lings bought it. There were others who said there were bad spirits. A witch doctor said the place was haunted and something bad would happen. So this was also something that people then took up and said, now the disappearance confirmed it. And I would like to say one thing about the spirits. In case you don't know about this, in Asia, this is a very important concept. A lot of people base decisions on spirits, or for example, if they buy apartments, or in Thailand, every building has to have a spirit house. to kind of protect your building or your house. So this concept about spirits is much stronger than in Europe or in America, for example. And of course, because of this closeness to this concept of spirits, this also involved this whole story about Jim Thompson's disappearance, because then of course people said it was the bad spirits or something was going on. So this is also some kind of context that we need to have in the back of our minds. And I'm giving you all the details for the case until Jim Thompson's disappearance, so you can assess it and maybe you can make up your mind, or maybe you find out more. So Thompson and Mangskor flew from Bangkok to Penang. And looking back, when she was interviewed, Connie Mangskor mentioned that most of the time they were together. There were only a few incidences during the whole trip where Jim Thompson was on his own. And there was one time where he was on his own in Penang. Suddenly he decided he needed a haircut. And this had to happen before they met friends for dinner. Connie Mangskor was a bit annoyed about this because she said it turned everything unnecessarily hectic. But this was also kind of Jim Thompson's character, and he also loved to go for walks on his own, so she just let him go and have his haircut. So this was one time in Penang where he was on his own, where people don't know, maybe something happened or nothing happened. And then she mentioned two other strange incidences from the drive. They hired a car and driver to take them from Penang to the Cameron Highlands. As I said before, this is quite a long drive. And then suddenly at Georgetown, the driver just basically abandoned the car, went into a building and came out 5 minutes later with another driver, and he kept on driving. They did not really think much about it. If you have traveled in countries like Thailand or Malaysia and you hired a car and driver, you may know that these things sometimes happen, and this doesn't mean much, but it happened a second time in the town of Tapa. I hope I said this correctly. And this was a bit more complicated, let's say. There was not only a driver change, but also a car change. And then they were told that they had to share a car with two other passengers. And then Connie Mangskor, she protested and she said, no, we have paid for a private car. We don't want to share with other people. We're not accepting this. So in the end, they got what they wanted. They got a private drive and car and were taken to the Cameron Highlands. So this was something that she told. Some people found it strange, but actually later on in the investigation, it was confirmed that this was nothing out of the ordinary, because the drive is so long that very often there are driver changes or car changes if you come from Penang or Kuala Lumpur. And also the taxi drivers from Kuala Lumpur and Penang, they often wanted to save on fuel, or they didn't want to increase the wear of the car. So that's why they brought them to a certain point, and then the car and driver were switched. So it was a bit strange for Connie Mangskor looking back, but actually it was something quite normal. It happened to investigators during that whole process of investigating the Jim Thompson case, and it had also happened to Jim Thompson's assistant when this person went to the Cameron Highlands as well. Some people do speculate maybe because Connie Mangskor refused to get into the car with these other people, they escaped a potential kidnapping, which may have happened later, but all of this is speculation. There's no real proof for that. They arrive at the cottage, and Dr. Ling only arrived 10 minutes before them. He came from Singapore. His wife Helen joined a bit later at 8 p.m. in the evening because she was still on business. And then they just had a quiet dinner, and all of them retired early. So nothing really special happened. The next day, Dr. Ling told Jim Thompson about a new trail that he had discovered, and Jim Thompson, who loved walking and hiking, immediately wanted to do it. And they decided to go on their own, Dr. Ling and Jim Thompson. And then Helen Ling and Connie Mangskor decided to do something else. I think they went shopping and then met them at the local golf club. Just one thing to explain about the Cameron Highlands. At the time, they were very popular for golfing and hiking. And the second one was not really the safest option, let's put it like this, because you had a lot of these hiking paths. But they were quite dangerous if you went off those paths, and a lot of people got lost. So this is also something that we have to keep in mind, that it was not the easiest hike that you may have planned in the Cameron Highlands. So Dr. Ling and Jim Thompson went on this hike, and when they arrived at the golf club, Dr. Ling was overwhelmed because what happened is that they did get lost. And then he tripped over a root, and then he hurt his ligaments. and they did not know where to go. And then Jim Thompson kind of bragged about his background, that he had some previous training in survival in the jungle, that he was the one who identified a stream or a creek that led them back to an area that they knew, and this is how they made their way to the golf club, and he saved them. So this is also maybe a bit ironic that the day before his disappearance something like this happened, and he boasted with his knowledge and survival training, and then the next day something like this happened. They went back to the cottage, nothing much happened. They had tea, they had dinner, then retired early, and the next day was Easter Sunday. So the Lings planned that everyone attended the service at the Anglican church near the cottage, and everybody was fine with doing this, but in the morning Jim Thompson said before they go to the church, he wants to walk down on his own and he will meet them at the church. So nobody really thought much of it. They again thought he really enjoys walking, and this is an interesting thing because shortly after his disappearance, people said he was never really alone during that trip, but there were quite a few incidences where he was on his own, and later on a lot of people speculated what happened during these times. So he did not go via the trails. He kept to the main road because he was wearing a nice silk suit. It was Easter Sunday after all. He met everyone at the church 15 minutes later, and after the church they went back, and they had actually planned to do a picnic near the cottage, and that picnic was prepared, and suddenly something weird happened, they said afterwards. Suddenly he got really restless, and then he said, oh, I don't really want to go somewhere, can't we just enjoy the picnic in the garden? But then the others convinced him and said, no, we want to go there, it's a beautiful place, let's all go together. And then he gave in. During the whole picnic he was acting a bit strange, a bit restless. So they were just thinking maybe he's just tired from all his work. He was also supposed to go to Singapore the next day, so maybe he was already thinking about work. Nobody really paid attention. So when they came back, it was similar to the day before. The Lings went upstairs to their room to take a nap, and also Connie Mangsco went to her room probably to do the same. Jim Thompson was last seen in the living room, and the friends did not really think much about it because they thought, we are retiring to our rooms, we are taking a nap or just relaxing, he's going to do the same. The Lings were then upstairs and they heard an aluminium deck chair being moved on the veranda. They did not look down because they thought it's just normal, he wants to relax, maybe he's just moving some stuff on the veranda. They did not really think much about it. Helen Ling remembered that she heard footsteps, according to her, European footsteps, not Asian footsteps. She could tell the difference. I don't know how you tell the difference, but that's what she said to the police later. Connie Mangsco came out of her room at 4:30. She had been packing because the plan was that they would leave early the next day for Singapore. And usually at around 4:35 they all had tea together, and Jim Thompson was not there. But again, they did not really think too much about it because maybe he had gone for a walk. What is interesting is that his bed was still completely made, so he never lay in there, so obviously he didn't take a nap. Also, the jungle box with the pills for the gallstone attacks was still in the room, so this is a sign that Thompson probably didn't plan a long walk because he always took those pills with him because the attacks could be really bad. Also, his cigarettes were still there and his jackets was hanging on the veranda. So they thought maybe he's coming back a bit later for tea and he's enjoying his walk. He wants to be on his own. And then they said, okay, at the latest he will be back before 6:30 because then it's getting dark. And the more time passed, the more nervous they became because at around 6 there was no sign of Jim Thompson. And when there was still no sign of Jim Thompson by the time it got dark, Dr. Ling just said, okay, I'm going to go to the golf club. Maybe he's there and he's having a good time and forgot to call us. So he drove down the road. But when he came back, again, there was still no sign of Jim Thompson. He also called up friends. For example, Jim Thompson's doctor was also in the Cameron Highlands by accident. She also hadn't seen him. Nobody had seen him. Nobody had seen him also along the road. So then Dr. Ling also called the police. He then also went to the station and reported that Jim Thompson was missing. And the police then said if Jim Thompson does not come back by the morning, they will start a full-scale search. And then I mentioned the rental agents before. Dr. Ling also called them. And then one of them came with a British Major and also a Cocker Spaniel. And they went to look in the jungle for Jim Thompson. But when they came back, they also couldn't find him. And by the morning, Jim Thompson had not returned, so the full-scale search started. In the end, it would involve 325 people, military, local police, police from other areas in Malaysia. There were also helicopters sent from Thailand because of his close connections to the military. There were also people from the local communities involved who knew the jungle really well and also the trails really well. And also Jim Thompson's sister was married to the Secretary of Air Force of the Eisenhower administration, so support also came from there. So we can already see this was an effort which was probably much more than for an ordinary person. This was probably because of his publicity, then also because he was very well known all over the world, and also because of his personal connections. Later on, a former colleague said that he had the feeling that the American embassies in Bangkok and also Kuala Lumpur did not really put in that much effort. He had the feeling that they just wanted to close the case, which fueled these theories around him supposedly being an agent and all of this, but this could never be proven. And also when we look at the effort that was made, we can see that this was an effort that was much bigger than usual. But until today, the reason for all these theories is probably because there was no clue whatsoever what was going on. Nothing could be found, no body, no hints, like for example, if he had fallen, if it had been an accident, maybe there would have been a piece of fabric somewhere in a branch. Nothing was found. If it had been an accident, then the dogs would have found a body, or there would be vultures in the sky, for example, that you could see. The police never really commented on everything else but this accident disappearance. The only thing that they once said was maybe he came across a leopard and that's why he completely disappeared, but this is another thing that could not be proven. Some people speculated if it was kidnapping, because at the time there were kidnappings in Malaysia, but the target were usually wealthy Chinese from Singapore or Penang. Maybe somebody thought Jim Thompson was a millionaire and that's why they kidnapped him. And then there were all these things. The jungle box was still in the room. The cigarettes were on the veranda. Maybe it was not a kidnapping. Maybe he was sitting at the veranda and he saw somebody who indicated that he should come over. Other people say or speculate that maybe he had a secret meeting or something like this. So nothing of this could ever be proven. The whole search lasted 10 days, and the most crucial days were day 3 and 4. After those days, people pretty much knew that there was not much chance to find him. One of the employees from Bangkok came to support. Also Sheffield, the business partner, announced that there was an award for $10,000 if Jim Thompson was found. Soon it was raised to $25,000. But despite all of the efforts, Jim Thompson was never to be found. And until today, this disappearance of the Silk King, this American businessman in Thailand, is still one of the most fascinating stories I have ever come across. I do have to say, after reading the book again, I was still thinking like, oh, there must be more. Can we solve this case? Maybe it will be solved, but I think we will never really know. Was he really an agent, which is the most prevalent of the theories? Was it an unfortunate accident? Was it a kidnapping? Maybe he wanted to disappear himself. Maybe he had reasons for the disappearance. We will never know. But I really find this story so fascinating. As I said, it's like an Agatha Christie crime story, but Poirot or Miss Marple could never solve it. But I also find his life very interesting, how he came from these beginnings in America to Thailand and he founded this amazing company, and also how he built up the Thai industry. So I think this combination of this mysterious disappearance and also how he built up the business in fashion is very, very interesting. So I hope you enjoyed this relatively long video this time. Did you know about the story of Jim Thompson, or was this the first time you came across him? Or do you have additional hints for us so maybe that we can solve this mystery? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video and if you learned something today, please let me know by subscribing to my channel if you haven't done so already, and also by liking my video. It really helps me a lot if you do this. If you want more fashion related articles, you can also head over to my website, thepinklookbook.com, and don't forget to check out my fashion label Pelagona. And if you enjoyed this trip to Southeast Asia, we can travel to Bangkok again together, because I have another video about Queen Sirikit of Thailand and her collaboration with the French couturier Pierre Balmain. Thank you very much for watching this video and see you in the next one.